This is the December 17th, 2014 interview of Mr. Ray Wolfe by Blair Williams for the Elizabeth V. and George F. Gardner Digital Library, an initiative of the Cumberland County Historical Society, recorded at 21 North Pitt Street, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Mr. Wolfe, do I have your permission to tape this interview?
Yes, you do.
All right, so we're just going to start with some questions. So could you tell me your full name?
Ray L. Wolfe.
Where and when were you born?
I was born in the Carlisle area, Gardner's, which is off Route 34, which is south of Carlisle, 1938.
All right. Do you know when your family first came to Cumberland County?
I do not.
Do you remember, do you know why, I guess? So do you have any memories of your neighborhood growing up?
Well, we lived out in the country and on a small farm, and pretty much my growing up days consisted of working in the orchards, thinning peaches, picking cherries, picking apples, tomatoes, and that sort of thing.
Were your parents farmers, or?
No, I just had a small farm. I worked for other farms, like Musselman's had, which is now Now's Foods, orchards that I worked in, and Garnet Coble had cherry orchards. He was over in the Gardner's area, and I picked cherries for him. And then Rice, I worked for him in summers also doing tomatoes, peaches, and all that sort of thing. And he had a packing shed as well.
What did your parents do for a living then?
Both of them worked in the crystal plants in Carlisle. My stepdad worked for P.R. Huffman, and my mother worked for McCoy Electronics out in Mount Holly.
Do you remember, did they ever tell you any stories about what it was like to work in the plants, or do you remember what that was like at all?
I think they were very satisfied. P.R. Huffman crystal plant here in town was, and I knew Mr. Huffman personally, and I think he treated his employees very well. And Luke McCoy had McCoy Electronics for years. And that was where my mother worked, and she thought highly of Mr. McCoy.
So growing up, are there any buildings, happenings, or special characters that stand out in your memory?
I remember the old market house downtown Carlisle. I remember the police station was way in the back because one year the Christmas parade was one of the first years I ever came to Carlisle to see the parade, and it was a lot of people and robust and everything around, and I got lost and ended up in the police station.
So you were pretty young then?
Yeah.
Could you just describe a typical day growing up in the county or out on the farm?
Well, in those days, in the spring of the year, when you had thin peaches, or Musselmans would send around a truck, and you would get on the truck and you would work for 10 hours, 50 cents an hour. So you made whole way $5 a day, which I thought was a lot of money then. And the same then with when cherry season came around. Garnet Coble had a truck that he sent around and picked up people like myself that wanted to work in the orchards.
What about attending school? Do you remember? Do you have any memories of school life?
Yeah, I attended boarding. I went to one-room schoolhouse for the first 6 years, and then I had the choice because of where I lived. I could have gone to Biglerville, Carlisle, or Boiling Springs, and I chose Boiling Springs. I'm not sure why, and I graduated there, and then after that I started to work in the bank, and then after that I went to school at nights and for many years at Harrisburg, on Market Street. I can't even think what the name of it was. And American Institute of Banking had a lot of banking courses, which I took as many of those as I could. And then I'm not sure the exact date, but I think it was in the late 60s. I attended a graduate school of banking in Wisconsin
Oh, wow.
and continued on in my banking career.
But so all throughout this period, though, you were working at Farmers Trust? Or
Yes, I was working at Farmers Trust.
do you remember what your first job at Farmers Trust was?
Teller and mailboy. And
What did that involve?
well, the teller, I was at the windows, which I would wait on the customers, cash checks, take deposits, and so forth. And the mail, and I had to go to the post office and pick up all the mail that was there for the bank, and then and later in the day had to process the mail that was at the bank and take it to the post office.
Did Farmers Trust support a lot of its employees in terms of taking additional banking courses? Or was that something that they pushed you to do, or was that just something that you had an interest in?
I had an interest in it, but they supported me in it, and the AIB courses, and as well as the graduate school, they paid for all that for me.
Could you just talk about sort of the various roles that you eventually ended up doing at Farmers Trust? You started out as a teller and mailboy, then you slowly moved up.
Then I went to what they call a note clerk. That's in the pamphlet there, shows that I was at the note window, and then after that, then I ended up being a assistant vice president, and I'm not sure of the year. At that point in time, I got involved in lending, pretty much small lending at that point, and then as years progressed, I got involved in commercial lending.
Could you just describe a little bit what it was like being a note clerk? And
Well, in those days, you just had promissory notes, and somebody would borrow money for a short period, 30, 60, 90 days. You just fill out a note, and they'd sign it, and when that note came due, they had the opportunity to either renew it, pay it down, or pay it off. And we had small applications that we had to take for that, but we didn't have all the disclosures that's required today for that kind of lending. And then I got involved in installment lending. That was pretty much mobile homes and automobile financing and that sort of thing.
what was Farmers Trust? So I imagine a lot of this was in the community.
Oh yes, it was strictly a community bank. At that time, we had Carlisle Trust, which was right across the street from Farmers Trust, and we had Carlisle Deposit, which was over where the vault is located now, and then across the street we had Cumberland Valley Savings and Loan, and then next door to us we had Carlisle Building and Loan. So we had a lot of local small banks, which have all been merged.
Do you remember what the sort of perception of Farmers Trust was in the community at this time, so the early 60s?
I was perceived as being a good local financial institution, but also at that time, so was Carlisle Trust and Carlisle Deposit. Carlisle Building and Loan and Cumberland Valley Savings Loans were savings loans organizations. They were not stock owned by shareholders. In other words, the Carlisle Trust and Carlisle Deposit and Farmers Trust were owned by shareholders that people held stock in. It was not a lot of stockholders. For example, when I started in the bank, Farmers Trust Company stock was very, very hard to get. I think I bought my first share in 1956 when I started to work here, and as I could afford it and as it became available, I continued over the years to buy the stock because I just thought it was a good investment.
And that's not something that's very common nowadays, correct?
Right. No, that's right.
Did that sort of alter, or did that have an impact on sort of how Farmers Trust was viewed in the community? The fact that you could buy stock in it and you received dividends
Yeah.
and so forth.
And back in those days, when somebody passed away and they had their estate to settle, there'd be an auctioneer that would appear on the courthouse steps on a Saturday morning. It'd be advertised, and they would auction the stock off. And that's pretty much how you find out what the value of it was, because there was always a lot of people that was interested in buying our stock.
So then you moved as an assistant VP into a little bit larger lending, small lending. What did that involve?
Well, that would involve farm loans and business loans for small businesses that people were in the construction business and automobile business. We did a lot of what they called floor planning in those days. The people would open a used car lot, and we would then finance the cars on the lot, and by doing that, then we look forward to them as they sold the cars to get the financing of the cars. So it was sort of a situation where you wanted to help the local business succeed, and you would then be able to get additional lending by buying the contracts that they would sell on the cars. In other words, a dealer at that time could, and they still may be able to, I'm not sure how it works today, but they would write up the agreement, and we would buy that agreement from them. We called that installment sales contracts.
To me, that sounds a little bit more like banking as I know it in 2014. Is it slightly different now, or is it pretty similar to?
Well, I think now that in the automobile business, I think most of that's handled through the manufacturers that have subsidiaries set up. But I'm sure there's some banks that still finance used car dealers that look forward to buying that paper from them.
And then commercial lending? Was that similar in terms of small businesses?
Yeah, pretty much small businesses. Back in those days, we had a lot of corporations in Carlisle. We had Carlisle Tire and Rubber, which in that photo is Joni Worrell, who was a director here. He headed that up. We had United Telephone. We had C.H. Maslin's, which wasn't a customer of ours. They dealt at Carlisle Trust across the street. And Kinney Shoe. Kinney Shoe was a big employer in our area. And Claude Lewis was a director in our board at one time, too. He has since passed. And, of course, most of those businesses are no longer here. Kinney Shoe, Carlisle Shoe, and United Telephone, and Farmers Trust. And it was a nucleus of people. For an example, if some organization wanted to have a fund drive, Bill Maslin from C.H. Maslin's might chair that, and he'd pick up the phone and he'd call Claude Lewis at Kinney Shoe, he'd call Joni Worrell at Carlisle Tire, and I'm not sure who headed up United Telephone, but and he'd call the banks as well. And before they even announced the campaign, he'd have like half the campaign covered with commitments that he already got. And that's something that Carlisle now misses, because we don't have the corporations here that we had at that time.
That local infrastructure in terms of corporations. Just so I can verify, the location of the bank was right on the square.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Was it 1 West High Street?
1 West High.
So where was that in terms of just location from the old marketplace? The marketplace had already been torn down by the time you had started working.
No, the marketplace, when was that that torn down? What year? It
I
may have been. I remember being there, but I don't remember when it was torn down. But I remember working at the bank when the new courthouse was built on,
All right.
on that location.
And then you eventually moved up to vice president. What could you just describe what some of your responsibilities as VP were and how they differed from some of your previous positions?
In those days, you didn't have a glorified personnel department and all that. And at that point in time, I got involved in personnel, which hiring and that sort of thing. And then when I moved to executive VP, I pretty much continued the same thing. At that time, in the 60s, late 60s, mid 60s, Harmon Fleck was the president and CEO, and he died on vacation in Florida. I think it was 72 or 3. And at that time, then the board made the decision, they had to make a decision who was going to be the new CEO, and they, lucky for me, they selected me, but it was a good board, and they pretty much did things local, and they didn't want to go outside the community to look for somebody.
I was kind of wondering, was the perception of you within the bank different because you had worked your way up throughout the ranks, or was that something that the board sort of keyed on as one of the reasons why you would be a good choice to lead the bank?
I guess they just thought that I had done a good job for the bank in the different positions I was in, and I'd be able to take that position and do well with it as well.
What about the various people that worked for the bank? Do you know of what they thought of you in terms of taking over that role, or?
I think pretty much everyone was happy to see me get the position.
And so reading a lot of the anniversary publications and the annual reports, I was kind of struck by sort of in the 60s and I guess post-World War II and the 60s, 70s, sort of the near constant rate of record growth and sort of every year was a new record in terms of assets and savings and loans. What was it like to work in the banking industry during that sort of period?
In those days, it was a lot of fun, I think, to be a banker. I'm
Yeah.
not sure it is today. And in 82, at that point, we could only branch. We couldn't branch outside Cumberland County. That was a Pennsylvania banking. We were a state chartered bank. That was a Pennsylvania banking law, and we built our first branch, and I can't tell you the date on that. That was in the 60s. That was Noble Boulevard, where PNC has an office, has it now. M&T sold that off to them. And then our next location was down in the West Shore in Camp Hill. We bought that from National Central, and the reason they put that branch up for sale, because of the laws, because they were going across the river and expanding there, and they couldn't have then a bank in Cumberland County. So we were fortunate we bought that, and that was a very good location for us in Camp Hill.
And there was also in '76 a branch in New Kingston too, out in the West Shore.
That was in Cumberland County.
So I'm just looking at my notes. So there were 3, and by '76 there were 5 branches. There were 3 in Carlisle, 1 in Camp Hill, and 1 in New Kingston. At this time, was Farmers Trust sort of the big bank in Carlisle in terms of, had it sort of taken a lot of business from some of the other banks that you mentioned earlier?
I think we had grown more than the other banks had, and we were always looking to try and merge some of the smaller banks into us, but unfortunately that didn't work back in the 60s. And then in 82 there was a new banking law that was passed that if you formed a holding company, you could expand anywhere pretty much. And in 84, we continued to look for branches. We bought some branches over in Perry County. We bought them from Mellon Bank. We had 2 offices over there. And then in 1984, we bought the Chambersburg Trust, where we merged the Chambersburg Trust into us. And then in 1987, we merged the First National Bank and Trust Company of Waynesboro. They came with us. And in 1990, we bought the First Federal Savings Bank over in Hanover. And the one that's not on here is the Williamsport Bank that we bought, First National of Williamsport. That was in Maryland, and I'm not sure why that was it's not on here, but we wanted to expand the bank as much as we could, and we were always looking for good banks that would fit into our way we wanted to do business. We left those banks in 1982. We formed Farmers Trust. Went from Farmers Trust to Financial Trust Corp. That was the holding company's name. We still operated Farmers Trust under its name, and we operated Chambersburg Trust under its name, and First National of Waynesboro under its name, and the same with the bank that we bought in Williamsport in Maryland. The bank, the ones that we changed the name to Farmers Trust was the offices that we bought in Perry County, and also the First Federal Savings Bank in Hanover. We merged them into Farmers Trust Company. They were smaller banks, and we couldn't see that having the structure there to keep them independent, so we just merged them into our bank.
Now, is it different having to report both to a board as well as having a lot of these mergers approved by shareholders? Did that
yes.
complicate things at all?
No, that was pretty much the trend then. Once that new law was passed in '82, banks were out looking to merge other banks in and that they thought fit their structure as far as the way they did business. There were a lot of smaller banks back in those days, which we don't have today because under the current banking laws and all the restrictions from the regulators, there's no way they could continue to operate. I think today probably a bank that's not over $1 million probably would have a tough time operating.
So you never received any pushback from shareholders?
No.
Stopping merger votes? Or... So, I mean, we talked a little bit about branch banking and how that was kind of a new innovation for especially a smaller bank in that period. One of the other things I noted was drive-in banking or drive-through banking, and how did that impact Farmers Trust?
I think we were one of the first banks to have a drive-through bank, and that was up 1 West High Street. That was in the rear of the bank. And matter of fact, I was a teller back in those days and worked that cage on occasions. And we were always open on Friday nights and Saturday mornings, so it was nice to be able to, even when I got elevated to some of the other positions, to be there on Saturday mornings to see and greet your customers. But it was we were the first in Carlisle to have a drive-through banking.
Did the community really respond to it?
Oh yes, Especially I can remember back in the old days when Thursdays and Fridays, when Reeves Huffman was another big employer here in the area, Reeves Huffman and Tire and Rubber, and when they paid, we'd have the whole alley lined up with cars that people were just coming through to either deposit their paychecks or cash their paychecks.
Do you think that helped to sort of spur the growth, being that first bank in Carlisle to have drive-through banking?
Yeah, I think people sort of looked at it as we were sort of the more aggressive bank. For example, across the street at Carlisle Trust Company, they didn't have any area they could put a drive-through in, so they had a sort of a kiosk out in the sidewalk, and it didn't go over very well because people weren't ready for that like they are today. You know, the kiosk is sort of the thing today.
And then I think it was in the 70s where sort of a lot of this computerized or electronic banking started taking place. And I noted that I think in one of your letters in the annual report, you sort of noted how Farmers Trust was innovative in that sense. Could you just talk a little bit about sort of what it was like to sort of introduce electronic banking? Or
we always well, back in the old days, we had posting machines, and everyone had a ledger sheet. And it was, and then as we moved forward, we always went with a service company. And I can remember when we went with a credit card. I think it was, I can't remember which one it was. I think it was a Visa card, but we didn't do that on our own either. We did that through PNB, Philadelphia National Bank. At that point in time, you had correspondent banks. For example, we had Mellon, we had Philadelphia National Bank, and a couple other ones. And what those banks looked to generate income, they would offer services to the smaller bank. And I know we did a credit card through Philadelphia National Bank, and we did all of our data processing through Mellon Bank.
but locally, I guess, sort of introducing a lot of this new technology, did that have any large impact on sort of this aggressive approach that you were taking? Were other banks not really embracing technology, or did they not have the ability to, I guess?
They had the ability to, and most of them, some of them had their own systems, and it was a constant change. Your electronic banking was really changing, so we felt we were better off to be like with Mellon with the data, their data center, because whatever Mellon was doing to a big bank in Pittsburgh, the data center also adopted that and gave us the opportunity to make changes, and we were sort of ahead of the curve on the other banks, because if they had their own system, then they'd have to go back and program and make a lot of changes, which took time and money.
What were your biggest, what did you mainly deal in terms of, what were the big assets that Farmers Trust held, I guess, in the 70s and the 80s? What were you mainly doing at that point? A lot of personal lending or
we
savings?
did a lot of industrial. At that point, there was an authority, and I can't think what the name of it was, that did tax. You could do tax-free financing for an example, when some of the new supermarkets were built. We went through the Industrial Development Authority, and that they qualified through all the tax ramifications. The interest on those loans were free to the bank, so we could price those somewhat accordingly. So we were pretty aggressive in that area. I know we did several supermarkets and other industrial buildings, and in order to qualify, they had to have so many employees, and there was a lot of ramifications to what you had to meet to be able to do those loans. We did a lot of those, and we had, well, Dave Rogers, who owned Cumberland Building at that time, was on our board. He had Butler Buildings, and he did a lot of buildings. For an example, in the West Shore, I can remember when Roar Buick was built. That was a Butler building, and because of Dave's contact with them, he would bring customers to us to see if we were interested in financing them, and we were pretty big in the construction business. J. Hurley and Company was a big contractor here in town, and we financed a lot of his construction.
What about, I guess, time and savings accounts? Were those, or bonds? Were those big in that time period?
Savings accounts were big in that time, and certificates of deposit. And back when interest rates, and I can't tell you the year they skyrocketed when like prime was 17%. We were paying well over 10% for certificates, and I'm not sure what on savings. And we had as I had mentioned before, car dealers that had floor plans, and a lot of banks felt that they had to stay with prime, so a lot of those banks raised their car dealers to prime, and the rates were just so prohibitive that the car dealers couldn't make it. So we didn't raise ours near what the other banks did, because we felt that we didn't want to drive them out of business, and we didn't want to own a lot of cars. So,
Yeah.
And that all passed, and here we are today. It's rates down 3 and 4%.
Was that a big scare in terms of in the 70s, inflation and stagflation?
Yeah, it was a real concern how you were going to price your product. And the other thing you couldn't do, we used to make, Farmers was always noted for being a bank that you could get a mortgage. And early on, we had quite a few mortgages, and they were always at fixed rates. And the problem then came, the regulators started to criticize banks that had a lot of fixed rate mortgages because of interest rate risk to the bank, because as rates would rise, you couldn't raise your rates on the mortgages. So the next big product that came in then was adjustable rate mortgages, and they were tied to prime or something, some index, and they would float. There'd be a limit that you could raise somebody's rate, but you could raise somebody's rate, and if rates went lower, they could be lowered as well. And then the next big thing, which is in effect today, is you packaged your mortgages. You did them all at the going rates, pretty much it's out there, but you couldn't hold them because you couldn't take that interest rate risk. So what you would do would be to package them and sell them to Fannie or Freddie. And we didn't do a lot of that. We probably did more adjustable rates and kept them ourselves, because people were, in those days, were reluctant to have you take their mortgage and then sell it to Fannie or Freddie, because they'd like to know where it was going. Because in most cases, when you sold them in those days, you didn't continue to service them. Whoever Fannie or Freddie then sold them to, they would get a new payment book and say your mortgage is now with this company, and this is where you'll make your payments in the future. And then the next year, that might change again. They might discontinue to sell them.
So people really like that personal touch then.
They like the personal thing. And the adjustable, we kept those. We didn't think there was a lot of interest rate risk there, and we held them, and they were good for the bank and good for the customer.
Did you have a lot of people coming in worried about interest rates or about their mortgage? I assume you didn't have many conversations as president, but did a lot of your employees, were they trying to quell fears? And
Yeah. and of course, other loans that were not at fixed rates, people would come in and be concerned because, you know, if somebody was paying 6% this year and next year it was 17%, that's a big jump for some people. And at that point in time, we didn't only finance used car dealers, we financed new car dealers, such as Graham out here in the Pike. At one time, we had his floor plan. So you had to be flexible, and you had to try to make good business decisions so that you didn't put them out of business because they couldn't afford to pay that kind of an interest rate.
I know here at the Historical Society, Farmers Trust was always was a big benefactor back in the 70s and 80s. Did farmers support a lot of local institutions? Was that a big goal for the bank?
Yeah, we were a big contributor to United Way, and when Historical Society and other organizations, fire companies, libraries had fundraisers, we probably always were one of the top givers because we felt that it was good to put the money into the community that made us what we were.
Then you've mentioned off and on about the various boards that you served with or on. Were there any individuals who really, stick out in your memory?
Not really. I should have brought along a list of things. I chaired the Carlisle Transit Board for quite a few years. That was over in Harrisburg. And the way that was done, the commissioners would select somebody. Commissioners would have like 2 from Cumberland County, and then have Dauphin County would have 2, and Harrisburg would have like 3. So the commissioners elected me or asked me to serve, and I ended up chairing that for quite a few years. And I was on the South Middleton Bowling Springs School Board for a good many years, and I chaired that, I think, for like 8 years.
What about on the Farmers Trust Board? Were there any people that you served with that really, or that were serving on the board that really stick out in terms of having a big influence on the bank and in terms of direction, or just were big personalities?
Charles Strayer, who was chairman of the board back in the early days, owned Troy Laundry. He was a real supporter of the bank, and I really looked up to him because he was chairman of the board. He owned Troy Laundry and did a lot of other things and did things for the community. But not when I was president, because he had passed then, but he would come in the bank every morning and sit down and talk to the president. That went back when Ray Leib was here. That went back when Harmon Fleck was here, Dale Seitz, and I was really impressed with that. And in the olden days too, the 2 of the men on the board there headed up the appraisals. In other words, we didn't have to go out and hire an outside appraisal. We had appraisal committee made up of the directors, and they would go out once a week and look at the properties we were going to take mortgages on, and they would appraise them. There was an appraisal card, and there was never that was permitted under the guidelines, and I think J. Frank Reiner and Ed Sunday were the 2 that did that. As a matter of fact, not a lot of times, but early in my career, I would go with them, and that really impressed me how they did that. It was always, matter of fact, some of the people we talk today when we get together, we joke about how we used to go out and do our own appraisals.
Were they spot on, or was there, in terms of, were you appraising things generally at the right level, or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Ed Sunday would say, well, I remember when so-and-so owned that property. And sometimes it'd be a drive-by, and most times it'd go in and physically inspect the property. But if it's just a small amount based on the value of the home, they would do a drive-by.
And then the board was composed of local individuals.
Oh, yes.
So And I assume that, being local, they had a certain idea of what a community bank or local bank should look like. Did these conversations ever come up in terms of, were people worried about the direction, and sort of expanding, or was that something that?
That's something pretty much that the whole board supported, the expansion.
You mentioned that you were impressed sort of early on in your career by Mr. Strayer sort of coming in every day and talking to the president at the time. Do you have any advice to anyone that potentially starting out in the banking industry, like that you would give them, and sort of what to do or what to learn or anything of that nature?
The way the rules and regulations are today, I really wouldn't want to be a banker, I don't think.
Nah.
It's a whole new world out there.
Do you think there's a loss in terms of that community banks can't really survive anymore, or is that taken up by credit unions, or?
I think the community banks are struggling right now. I think with all the rules and regulations, it just makes their overhead so high. They have all these extra people in the compliance departments and all these regs they got to follow. It's tough.
Before I forget, when did you retire from Farmers Trust?
When Keystone merged us and took us, I was chairman of the board of Keystone for a year, and then after that, and I still was on the board of Keystone. I was on the board until they merged with M&T, but pretty much after my 1 year chairing the board at Keystone, which I had an office over in Harrisburg at Keystone, I wasn't very active. As a matter of fact, I wasn't asked to be very active. And after that year, I had an office in Carlisle as well as an office over there. But pretty much after that year, I gave up my office space and thought it was time to bow out.
And what year did Farmers Trust merge with Keystone?
Well, in '96 we signed an agreement in December, and then it took place in the second quarter of '97.
Do you remember what any talk in the community? Was there any worry in the community that they were losing this 150-year institution? Or
yes, a lot of concern, and one of the reasons that when we merged the bank in, took bank in Chambersburg, Waynesboro, Hanover, even and Williamsport, we normally would give 2 board seats.
Mm-hmm.
And after that many mergers, our board sort of lost control because we had more members of other boards that came part of our board, and most of them were looking for a double dip. You know what I mean? They weren't satisfied with just coming with us. They wanted to build financial trust to the point that we were going to be attractive, and we were looked at as a lot of banks were trying to talk to us, and the board sort of was split on that. I sort of fought it for years, didn't want to merge, and finally it came to the point that I knew the battle was over, so I just sort of rolled over and said, okay.
So at this point, the holding company was Financial Trust,
Right.
But the local banks were still Farmers Trust in terms of
The local banks, yeah, the local offices. And so were the other banks that we merged in that we kept independent.
Mm-hmm.
They had their own, Chambersburg Trust, for example, had their own board of directors. I sat on all those boards. Most of them, the boards didn't meet every week. For example, Farmers only met once a month, and Chambersburg only met once a month. But they retained somewhat their independence. They were independent. They had their own CEO, and
We've talked about it a little bit, but I'm just quickly, how has Cumberland County and Carlisle changed since your first memories of both?
Well, you know, as I go back, I keep going back to the Carlisle Tire and United Telephone and C.H. Masons and Kinney Shoes and Carlisle Shoe and all those. We've lost all that now. Now we're a warehouse community, and trucking, and I don't think the warehouses. Now I think Allen Distribution is. I think they're pretty good to the community because they're local, but I think most of the other ones are not, and they don't support the community like our other corporations did early on, and the trucking companies especially. I think you see that in the United Way. You look at the United Way, it has not been able or close to make their goal, and they haven't been able to raise the goal because they just don't have the support that they need.
Well, just is there anything that I missed or that you want to talk about before?
No, not really.
I'm by no means a banking expert, so I'm sure I missed something that.
Well, I have a sheet here that points out it started in the 60s, and you may have that, and I don't know if you were aware, in 92, I think it's 92, I have to get my glasses out. Yeah, 92, we were recognized in the U.S. Banker, which is a national publication for our profitability, and I just thought I'd bring that along in case you wanted to see it. If you already have one of these.
Yeah, I think we have 50, 60, and 100. I was particularly struck in some of those publications by sort of that focus not only on the bank itself, but the community and all the photos of the community and just sort of how the community had changed so much since 1868 and then 1902 when Farmers Trust was first organized. And then it's changed dramatically since then too. So.
Yeah, I think we're fortunate to have M&T because I think M&T is a good bank. Now we just had another couple other mergers here recently. Integrity, which was run by Gibson, who was one of my competitors, and he was a good competitor. Integrity is now sold out to S&T, and then Susquehanna, which was back in my good days, was Bob Bollinger was the president of Susquehanna out of Lillis, and very, very competitive, and a good bank. And now Susquehanna is merging with BB&T out of the Carolinas. So, and BB&T is a good bank. Don't misunderstand me, but we're losing. For an example, Susquehanna, I'm sure in their areas have financially supported a lot of charities, but I'm sure when BB&T has a commitment that they have to do things, but they probably won't do it to the extent that Susquehanna has. And I don't think that M&T, even though they're a good bank, but they're a big bank and they've got a lot of communities they've got to make contributions to. They don't do what Farmers, for example, did when we were an independent bank.
I imagine too that their focus would be more on national or regional organizations rather than maybe the local community.
Yeah, I would think so.
Well, if you don't mind, so you're just talking a little bit about your present. You now live in South Carolina.
I live here 6 months out of the year and 6 months, about 5 months in South Carolina. I had that place. I had a place down there when I worked, I've been down there. I bought it in '87, so I was still working, and I didn't spend much time. My wife spent more time than I did, and enjoy it very much.
A lot of golf, or
Yeah, I play golf 3 or 4 times a week down there. I hack.
I think most people. That's a good description of their game. Where do you live in? Do you live in downtown Carlisle, or sort of?
No, I live out towards Mount Holly Springs.
All right.
Rice Elementary School's out there on the right, and Ladner Lane goes off to the left. And I've been out there for 48 years.
Oh wow. So I guess the reason I ask is I'm just wondering like what the community like is out there in terms of, is it a close knit community, or?
Yeah, very close knit.
And what about in South Carolina? Do you notice a difference between Carlisle and where you live down there, or?
Well, pretty much all the people down there, it's a gated community in the Hilton Head area, and I'd say 95% are all retired people. So
there isn't that
here,
sense of cohesion or community down there that you might find up here.
No.
Is that I'm wondering, is that sense of community something that you noticed while you were living in Carlisle, or did it become more apparent when you started moving or spending more time outside of this Carlisle bubble or Cumberland County bubble?
No. I think it. I think don't misunderstand me. The place I have in South Carolina is very good and community oriented too. I think the difference there is that all the people are retired, and we all had the same goal, and a lot of people came from heading up industries or and doing things. So we have a lot in common that way. Here, you live in a community, and the people around you still work. So you don't have down there. You have a more knit with the people who you see more often in the golf course and you see often in the clubhouse and places, because we're all the same thing. We're all retired. Up here, a lot of my neighbors have to work, so I may not get to see them for weeks upon a time.
This is kind of an abstract question. You mentioned that in South Carolina, there's sort of that shared history in terms of, you're all retired, and so you all, headed up industries and so forth, and you're all in the same place. But in Carlisle, is there a shared history in terms of a lot of people grew up here, so, Boiling Springs alumni, Carlisle High alumni. Is there that sense of shared history, or is it just that you're living in the same neighborhood, so you kind of see each other every now and then?
It's sort of like you're just living in the same neighborhood and seeing everybody.
All right.
Matter of fact, how I got out there and been there for so many years. Early on in the banking business, salaries wasn't all that great, so I would build 3 or 4 houses a year on speculation and sell them, and I bought that lot with the intention where we're living now to build a house and put it in the market and sell it, because in the meantime I sold the one I was living in, so we moved in there and we've been there ever since.
We'll just get a little bit into personal history just so I can cover everything here. How did you meet your wife or your spouse?
Well, I was in Boiling Springs and she was in York Springs at the Granger's picnic one year.
All right.
We met each other and it grew from there.
What year was this? Do you remember?
In the mid-50s.
And then any children or grandchildren?
I have 3 children. I have Buzz, who has Wolfe and Company Real Estate here in town, and my daughter Sandra's Sandra Elias. They have Campus store. which is student loan business up the Rittner Highway. Matter of fact, the building they're in was my corporate building at one time. And then I have a third son that works security for UPS, and he lives in Hummelstown. And I have 8 grandchildren and
Oh, wow.
2 great-grandchildren.
Wow. So one of your children kind of followed you into the banking industry a little bit.
My daughter, yeah, to a degree. When she graduated from Lehigh, and when she graduated, she worked for IBM.
Oh, wow.
And after she had her first child, and she traveled a lot for IBM, and after she had her first child, she decided she didn't want to do that. So she has started a couple new businesses after that, and been very successful.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Wolfe, for coming in today and speaking with me and talking a little bit about Carlisle, Cumberland County, and Farmers Trust.
Well, good to be with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.